Hello class, and welcome to a new analysis of a self-portrait as a Garage Emcee by Kayo Chingonyi. This poem is an autobiographical piece about a young boy, Kayo himself, growing up in South London, listening to pirate radio and discovering music. Its main themes that we will explore later are identity, memory, class, and the way music shapes who we become. Before we look at the stanzas themselves, let's take a moment to analyze the title, Self-Portrait as a Garage Emcee. The first significant word is self-portrait, which is an allusion to a high form of art with a huge tradition and that is highly revered in the world of art. The self-portrait, which was born during the Dutch Renaissance and was mastered by iconic painters such as Van Gogh and Rembrandt, alludes to a very respected and revered art form. And so this stands in absolute contrast with the word, the expression Garage Emcee, which is a juxtaposition. Garage Emcee belongs to the world of underground music, pirate radio stations, makeshift studios, and the urban, sort of raw and independent music scene of the late 90s UK. And so by placing them directly beside one another in the title, Chingonyi forces us to ask whether these two worlds are as different as we think or as we might assume. The poem's answer, as we will see, is that they are not. So we will first start off with part one of the first stanza. I'll leave you a moment to read the first part of the opening stanza and put the video on pause. So the first figure of speech that appears in this stanza is synesthesia. In the phrase, the fuzz of traffic. Here, the word fuzz is both tactile and sonic, and it really conveys a sensual experience to the reader, and rendering the poem very immersive off the rip. Here, it's obviously a reference to the blurry, fuzzy sound that you hear whilst trying to calibrate and to tune an analog radio, where you can hear the different frequencies before you land on the right network, before you land on the network you want to listen to. And aside from this, Chingonyi builds a semantic field of dull and adult noises, domestic noises, such as traffic reports, dinner table jazz, and topical chat. So what this is meant to convey is the different channels and networks that Chingonyi, or the speaker, is flicking through before arriving to his preferred network, which is Magique FM. We then have a personification where the latch announces Mom's return. The latch, which is an inanimate object, is given agency, is given power to announce, to communicate, just like a human would. What Chingonyi wants to really unveil through this personification is that the latch becomes a herald, an announcer of his mother's return, which ultimately puts an end to his listening session. We also have interesting diction. The word stagnant carries connotations of something gone still, slightly rotten, neglected, whilst the word littering is a word we normally associate with mess in a public space. So applied to the kitchen, it suggests that the household is under real economic pressure. They build an honest and unsentimental picture of the domestic world, which the speaker grew up in. Finally, we see in this part of the poem an asyndeton. Indeed, there are no coordinating conjunctions linking the sentences and the clauses together, as the poem seems to be a huge run-on sentence or the stanza, is a huge run-on sentence which never seems to end. And this gives a sort of a breathless and crowded and chaotic feel, which maybe recreates the experience of a memory. A memory isn't linear. It doesn't have a fixed objective and a clear direction. It is sort of chaotic. Let's now move on to the second part of the first stanza. I will leave you a couple of seconds in order to pause the video and read it for yourself. So, as you have understood, this section really introduces the cassette player, and with it, a set of proper nouns that reveal and unveil the social world in which, the social background which the speaker comes from. So, first of all, we have three different place and brand names which act like synecdoches. They stand in for an entire social and economic world. Tandy, for instance, was a budget electronics chain. On the other hand, Wandsworth is a place in South London which is known to be, the more working class and more derelict area in London. We also have words such as buying something from part exchange, which means trading in an old object to offset the cost of the new object which is being bought. The red dial, on the other hand, is an example of symbolism and imagery. It is the only color named in the opening lines of the poem, and that makes it stand out, especially against the gray and stagnant domestic scene described previously. The red dial, therefore, makes the cassette player seem vivid, warm, and precious for the speaker. Finally, we see the word now defunct. This word carries a quiet connotation of loss. The Tandy branch no longer exists, and therefore the world which is being described is gone. It no longer exists. This word that is on the surface trivial and quite insignificant is in reality a deep reflection on loss and therefore on memory and the remembrance of a world that is long gone. I'll leave you a moment now to read this final part of the first stanza before I begin the analysis. So, as you have understood, this section moves us from the domestic world of the speaker into a wider reflection of the world of music itself, where it comes from and what it sounds like. First of all, we start with a striking example of bathos. Bathos is an effective anticlimax created by the poet, and it is really apparent in this line since previously Kayo Chingonyi had compared Garage Emcees to the brilliant work of self-portraits, a long-standing tradition of high art. But now he descends quite deep, speaking about the underwear section of Littlewood's catalog. The phrase R&B on E-numbers is then a vivid metaphor. E-numbers are food additives associated with hyperactivity. The music is being compared to something artificial, buzzing, energetic, frenetic, and overstimulating. The music has an inebriating effect on its listeners, and it makes them feel a sort of ecstasy. Here, Chingonyi really emphasizes the kinetic quality of the music, which is charged and strong and carries a huge amount of energy and force. We then have a brilliant example of onomatopoeia. Indeed, the hi-hats produce a hiss. Here, the word hiss is an onomatopoeia, as it phonetically imitates the sharp and sibilant sound of a hi-hat cymbal. Next, we have two examples of similes. The hi-hats are first compared to hydraulic pistons, and then the snares are compared to tins dropping on tiled floors. Now, to analyze the first simile, the hydraulic pistons gives the music a sort of industrial and mechanized quality, a rhythmic power. The second simile, in which Chingonyi compares the snares to tins dropped on tiled floors, shows that the snare drum sounds sound like a household accident, an everyday sound. And really, what Chingonyi is doing is he's rooting and grounding his music into everyday life. He's not presenting it as some glamorous thing and harmonic and angelic instruments. He says that music is similar to sounds that we hear every single day. This music is made out of the same materials as everyday life, as ordinary life. It isn't sort of transcending and superior. This is a show of humility by Chingonyi, who tries to ground his music. Next, we have an enjambment. The line break here, after the word hiss, actually stretches it and forces the reader to emphasize on it. And it really reinforces the sensory perception that the reader receives whilst reading this poem, which makes it all the more immersive. Then there is a beautiful show of metaphor, as the music is piped in. By saying that the music is piped in, Chingonyi compares this music to the semantic fields of water and plumbing. The music flows continuously into the domestic space, like something essential and sustaining. The sources it flows from are listed in a triplet: backroom studios, sheds, and distant kitchens. Chingonyi distances himself from the grandeur and the splendor usually associated to the art of making music, saying that it is very spontaneous and raw rather than glamorous. And this idea is reiterated with the irony used by Chingonyi. The image of the decks set up in pride of the place on a good table, usually reserved for special occasions, is a moment of warm irony. Every working class household has a good piece of furniture kept in reserve for important moments. And so the fact that it is now being used for a pirate radio equipment is both comic and quietly radical. I will now once more give you a few seconds to pause the video and read the beginning of the second stanza. The first thing that is instantly noticeable is the shift of the pronoun. The poem moves from I to we. This use of the collective pronoun draws the speaker's friends into the poem for the first time. This creates a sense of shared adolescent community. The speaker is therefore not alone in his musical world. We then have a metaphor, as the voices of the MCs are compared to the voices of cigarette smokers who smoke 40 a day. So this is used by Chingonyi to evoke a deep and roughened, warm voice, which signal experience and carry a sort of authority. We then have colloquialisms such as big up and rave, which come from the vernacular of British garage culture. Its presence in the poem gives a sense of authenticity and rawness. It is a very lucid recount of Chingonyi's own experiences, which isn't filtered at all, but totally spontaneous. The choice of diction is also very interesting. Here, casual bravado indicates that whilst these MCs have huge and command huge amounts of respect and courage, bravado means courage, this is casual. This is sort of second nature to them. It's spontaneous. There's a sort of an effortlessness in the way and in the attitude of these MCs. Chingonyi obviously admires these MCs, as it is this effortless aura that he finds so irresistible because it seems so unforced. Chingonyi and his friends have for these older MCs is shown by the juxtaposition years out of reach but ours to keep. So the first part, years out of reach, indicates that at that time Chingonyi was just a little boy, looking up and admiring older MCs. However, the second part, but ours to keep, shows that Chingonyi wants to take ownership of this lifestyle that he admires so much. The MCs, the raves, the women, the late nights. Through the act of recording, they can claim ownership of the music itself, even though they cannot yet live the life. And the means in which these young boys produced music is mentioned with ruthless specificity. A TDK cassette bought 4 in a pack for £1. So here this numerical, this monetary language used really shows the limited spending power and purchasing power of these young boys and reinforces the idea of quite a difficult social upbringing. And so we see here the contrast between the boys' desires and Chingonyi's desire to become this musician, which is sort of limited by a material reality and a sense of poverty, obviously. Once more, we have other colloquialisms such as couldn't stretch, pocket money, chipped in. This really deepens the sense of intimacy and, again, authenticity as Chingonyi uses language that he used at that time. He really doesn't try to filter what his experiences were like. In their content, these words really convey the toughness and the ruthlessness of working class daily life. In order to fund your passions and afford to pursue your interests, you need to stretch your budget, chip in when you can't afford something on your own, and rely on your quite meager pocket money. So once more, Chingonyi wants to reiterate the socioeconomic hardship encountered by himself and his friends. We now move on to the second part of stanza 2, and I will let you once more pause the video and read it for yourself. So once more, the poem shifts focus. It introduces the mother's cassette collection as the speaker's primary resource of music. The choice of diction is a very interesting element of this second part of the second stanza, most notably with the words plunder and cash. Plunder means to raid or to pillage, and so it gives the act of borrowing his mother's tapes, which is quite a sort of an insignificant act and gesture. It gives it a mock heroic, a piratical quality, as if the speaker is a raider helping himself to treasure. And cash reinforces this idea. A cache is a hidden store, something deliberately set aside and concealed. Together, these words give the mother's cassette collection a mythic quality. It's a secret hoard which the speaker has to go on an adventure in order to acquire and attain. Once more, we have a brilliant use of enchantment by Chingonyi. The line break falls just before the vulnerable phrase, she once loved, creating a pause that mimics the reluctance and the difficulty to admit of the mother. The mother had pleasures she is not prepared to own publicly. Here we have once more allusions, this time to Lucky Dubé and Prince. Lucky Dubé was a hugely influential South African reggae artist. His presence in the mother's collection signals a diasporic musical identity. Prince, on the other hand, is a global icon. Both of these artists are said to be off-limits by Chingonyi, meaning that the mother really values these cassettes and does not want to let go of them easily. This idea of an inviolable rule, of an untouchable and unbreachable norm, is reiterated by the grammatical choice of a declarative sentence. This sentence is highly short, and it really gives off this idea of a blunt, final, and rule-like norm. The full stop closes the sentence like a door. There is no negotiation. Let's now move on to the final part of the third stanza. I will leave you a minute to pause the video and read it for yourself. As you have understood, this section is really about ingenuity, how the speaker turns anything he can get his hands on into a source of music and a material for identity. After the sacred off-limits names like Lucky Dubé and Prince, the arrival of Kenny Rogers is a brilliant piece of bathos. Rogers is a well-known country music singer, which is very culturally distant from both African reggae and UK garage. And yet, his lyrics become the speaker's playground performance material. He basically uses Kenny Rogers' music and lyrics to make his own remix and to make his own sound. The gap between what he wanted and what he had to work with is funny and touching. And this really reveals his honesty, his lucidity. He tells it as it is. We then have a brilliant example of metaphor. As to earn stripes is an expression drawn from the military, meaning to prove oneself through an achievement. The lunchtime recitation of Kenny Rogers' lyrics becomes a rite of passage, a way of building a reputation among his peers. We once more have an enjambment. As you can see, this poem is just an endless sea of enjambments, but this one is particular. Indeed, the word small enough, which is hyphenated, so connected by a hyphen, is broken across the line break with a hyphen. This might be a way for Chingonyi to convey the fiddly, precise, and careful business of cutting just the right amount of sellotape, making just small enough balls of tissue. Finally, the technical vocabulary, such as notches along the apex, tabs to prevent dubbing, is a piece of precise diction and jargon language that validates the speaker's knowledge and know-how in this particular field. And we now finally move on to the third stanza, part 1. I'll leave you a moment to pause and read it. Once more, we have a second change of pronoun. This time we move from I to you. And in doing so, it changes the entire relationship between the poem and the reader. It is a case of apostrophe, where the speaker is directly addressing either his younger self or the reader. We are subtly being spoken to, invited into the memory as participants rather than outside observers. This intimacy is quite immediate and disarming, to say the least. We once more have an example of personification, as the Walkman was banished. The Walkman isn't simply stored away, it was given an exile, a punishment, a life sentence. It is treated with the seriousness of a beloved companion. So this emotional attachment that Chingonyi has with his Walkman is reinforced by the diction cherished on line 2. The diction silver box is once more highly interesting, as it is a metaphor through which Chingonyi addresses his Walkman. Silver gives it a metallic and precious quality. It is not just a gadget, but something worth treasuring and keeping and valuing. The act of concealing the Walkman is described through a long paratactic chain of clauses. As you can see, there are no conjunctions linking the 5 verbs together, and it really creates a sense of shortness, of activity, of movement, of energy. It also creates the idea of a procedure that is well rehearsed and almost automatic. We then have a semantic field of academic mathematics, vertices, indices, factorials, Napier bones. It is a cluster of formal and academic language. These terms represent everything the speaker is actively ignoring. This semantic field really shows how the music absorbs not only his personal life and his free time, but also his academic life and his schooling. The music is therefore ubiquitous. He cannot detach himself from it for even a split second. Let's now move on to the second part of the third stanza, which is very short. Firstly, we have once again a personification. We have the breath wheezing its way through each line. Here the breath is given agency, movement. It pushes itself through the lyric with effort. Wheezing carries the connotation of strain, of something working hard, of physical effort, and it's almost painful. The speaker is not passively listening, he is concentrating intensely and absorbing the words into his body. This shows how important music is for Chingonyi. Chingonyi's eyebrow or brow being crimped shows how concentrated he is, that it becomes apparent on his face and on his eyebrows. This makes the secret listening feel like serious and earnest study. Finally, the whole stanza closes with a rhetorical question. The question mark at the end of concentrated does not require an answer. It assumes shared experience. It forces the reader to answer it by himself, as the answer is deemed obvious, manifest, self-explanatory. It also really includes the reader. The memory isn't personal but shared. That is why the reader is capable of answering this question himself without need for an explanation. Finally, let's move on to the last stanza, which I kept in its entirety, and you can press pause and read it for yourself before I begin. The fourth and final stanza is the shortest in the poem, and it is quite unique in this poem. Whilst there was a very warm and digressive and richly detailed energy in the first three stanzas, this falls away entirely in the last one, where we are left with a single action described slowly and deliberately. First of all, the diction dregs signifies residue. It means the lowest residue, what is left at the bottom after everything of value has been used up. The speaker has worked his way through his mother's entire collection, all of the dregs. Nothing of worth is left. Nothing of worth is left except for this one black TDK. This idea of absence and depletion and exhaustion is reiterated in the diction. Diction which describes this unmarked black TDK cassette. It has no label, it has no case, no identity. It's interesting because the cassette is described entirely out of what it lacks. It is not described positively, but negatively. And so this really builds up mystery and anticipation, making the reader wonder what this cassette could possibly be. The final action is rendered through a paratactic sequence of 5 verbs. I lifted it, weighed it in my hand, slid it cleanly into place, pressed the play button, and waited. Each verb is given its own weight, its own space, and the pace really decelerates as the poem approaches its ending, where the Walkman section rushed through its actions in breathless succession. Here, each movement is slow and deliberate, and this is obviously to build up anticipation and suspense. Weighted in my hand is another metaphor used by Chingonyi. To weigh something is not only to measure its weight, its mass, but also to assess its worth. When one says, I'm weighing the different options, you are not physically weighing it. Therefore, the speaker is both literally and metaphorically weighing this unknown tape, measuring its significance before he even knows what is on it. And finally, the poem ends on "and waited." The music never plays, the tape's contents are never revealed. The poem closes in the silence between pressing play and hearing sound. The self-portrait, therefore announced in the title, is left incomplete. The identity is still forming. The tape is still unheard. So all the anticipation and suspense that Chingonyi had built up during the earlier stages of the poem are left unanswered, which makes the mystery even bigger. And this is maybe to convey that an introspection, or in other words, an analysis on one's own identity, or in this case, a self-portrait, can never be completed. The identity of a person is ever changing. It is never fixed. It is never continuous, but always fluctuating. And perhaps the lack of ending, so to speak, or the lack of resolution of this climax is to show that a self-portrait can never be finished, can never be completed. Before we move on to our conclusion, let's take a brief look at the poem's form, structure, and rhythm. In terms of form, the poem consists of 4 stanzas of decreasing length, 15, 13, 10, and 7 lines. The shrinking is deliberate. The poem physically narrows as it closes in on its final suspended moment. Each stanza ends with a full stop, making each one sealed, close. And so we could maybe think that each stanza is a unit of memory, a specific piece of memory that is fully transcribed in this poem and reaches its ending. However, within each stanza, enjambment is relentless. Each line carries over without pause, one into the next, creating a breathless, continuous forward motion. The stanzas are closed on the inside and breathless on the inside. And this could reflect the fact that, as I said before, memory is never linear, it's never continuous, it's always fluctuating, going into different directions and tangents. And so although each stanza represents a certain unit, pre-structured unit of memory, within the unit of memory, it is quite foggy, it is quite blurry. Structurally, the most important feature is the poem's cyclical structure. It opens in a moment of waiting. Chingonyi mentions the stillness between the last bell and the latch, and it closes on another moment of waiting. The last word is waited, as you read. The poem is therefore framed between 2 silences, 2 states of suspension, of inertia. In both cases, the speaker is in the gap, the in-between space where something is about to happen but hasn't yet. In terms of rhythm, the poem is written in free verse, very clearly. There is no fixed meter, no rhyme scheme. The rhythm is controlled through enjambment, which creates a forward momentum, and caesura, the internal pauses created by commas within a line, which slow the pace down and give individual details their weight. And finally, to conclude, to bring everything together, what is this poem really doing, and what does Chingonyi want us to take away from it? At its heart, Self-Portrait as a Garage Emcee is a literary self-portrait. It is a self-portrait made out of words in which Chingonyi explores his own identity. Specifically, how identity is not given but slowly assembled. The speaker does not become a garage MC in any finished sense. He is a schoolboy raiding his mother's cassette collection, covering notches with sellotape, etc. But Chingonyi's argument is that This is exactly how a self is built. Quietly, obsessively, out of whatever cultural materials are within reach. The self-portrait is never complete, and the poem ends before it is, leaving us suspended in the moment before the music begins. Social class is present in every single line, and whilst it is not explicitly mentioned, it offers a sort of framework for the poem. Every single decision, every single act and gesture of the speaker is sort of limited, confined by material limits, by material requirements and conditions and social poverty. The brands, the prices, the borrowed objects, the good table, all of them allude to social class, even though it isn't mentioned clearly. Memory also shapes the poem's form. The associative, digressive, one thing leading to another quality of the free verse reflects, mirrors the way memory actually moves. Ownership and desire also permeates the poem greatly. There is obviously a gap in what the speaker desires and what he can physically, materially accomplish. The speaker wants what is out of reach and finds a way to claim it anyway, recording it, memorizing it, and repeating it at school, performing it. And on that note, thank you very much for having listened to my analysis of Self-Portrait as a Garage MC by Kayo Chingonyi. Leave a like, subscribe, and come back for the next analysis.